You too. Hi, everybody. I'm Kenny. I'm an alcoholic. I think I'm supposed to open this meeting with the Serenity Prayer. So let's observe a moment of silence for everybody that's still suffering, both in and out of the fellowship, followed by the Serenity Prayer. Thank you. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Whew, thank you. I'm Kenny K. from Kalamazoo. It seems like Mel said she looked up to me. I've been following her footsteps for years. I met Mel a little over 10 years ago, and when I got active with our area, Western Michigan, and it seems like I've been her alternate many times over. I was her alternate when she was our area chairperson, and then I became her alternate when she was delegate. And I've followed her lead in other areas too, like speaking. She spoke last year, and then it's my turn this year, but she's been a mentor to me. Truly grateful to have friends like Mel in this fellowship. I was thinking a little while ago, there was another time that Mel spoke before me, and I thought of that a couple weeks ago. I was at the annual breakfast in the Kalamazoo area we have for our district, and a friend of mine spoke a couple weeks ago, and he took his shoes off before he spoke. Said he was standing on humble ground, and I thought it reminded me of several years ago when I spoke the year after Mel at an event in Turtle Lake, Michigan. It's a nudist resort, and they have an annual AA roundup every year. And I know Mel spoke at that. The next year I got a call and they asked me to speak, and I had to search on that one, boy. I did some soul searching, but I did speak, and I wore a bow tie. But there was no podium. I got to tell you, I felt kind of awkward. And I've heard over the years expressed, to a speaker if they're nervous, to picture their spectators in underwear. And I got to tell you, I was hoping that some of these folks would have only had underwear on, to be honest with you. But so I'm grateful to be here tonight, fully clothed, and giving my talk one more time. But it's an honor to be here, and gratitude. I got gratitude today. It's been an awesome day, really. I was supposed to work this morning, but due to the nasty weather, we took this morning off, and I had a little extra time to spend in prayer and meditation like I do every morning, and a little in reflection on my life and in the talk I was going to give. And I know I try not to plan my talks because I always screw it up, so I try to give it over to God and ask for His guidance. But I pulled out some photo albums I hadn't looked at in probably a couple years, and it brought back some very fond memories, as well as some terror, some nightmares. So it really, I reminisced on my life. I believe I was probably born an alcoholic, but alcohol didn't become a problem for me until I was 12. I was drinking at a very early age. I believe they probably put beer in my bottle. My father and my mother weren't alcoholics. My father did drive a beer truck, though, and I used to go on the route with him in the summers during summer vacation. And that was one of my favorite things to do, to drive around Berrien County, Michigan, and go to the different taverns and liquor stores and deliver beer. And And then afterwards, on a lucky night, he would stop at the bar, the tavern, and I'd get to eat popcorn, drink pop, and play pool and watch them drink. But my father could drink 2 or 3 beers and go home, and that was it. And didn't realize that till later in life that I couldn't. But I drank at an early age. In fact, I have some memories of sneaking in my grandmother's pantry, and she would make homemade wine, and they kept beer in there too. But I remember guzzling off of that homemade wine. I remember the feeling it gave me. But actually, it was 12. I was 12 at a family reunion, and drank so much whiskey and beer mix that I vowed for the first time in my life I was never going to drink again. And obviously, I broke that promise to myself. It didn't take too long. I found other things. There was other flavors of alcohol that worked just as well, if not better. But drinking became part of my life through my teens. That's how I coped. I was a very insecure child, timid, shy, no self-worth, and I found my release through alcohol. I was one of the smallest guys in my class growing up. I went to a Lutheran school in grade school, and there was only one other kid that was shorter than me. And I was bullied and picked on most of my life through school. And it was devastating at the time. I didn't know who I was, didn't know who I wanted to be. And alcohol helped me to be somebody I thought I needed to be. But drank all through high school. I barely made it through high school. I actually flunked my senior year, but I did go back just for my parents to graduate. But as soon as I was done with school, I had no desire to further my education. My older brother and older sister both went through college, but I just wanted to get out of Michigan. I was born and raised in St. Joseph, and I was going to go to Florida, but a buddy of mine was heading out west to Utah and convinced me to ride along. And on the way, I convinced him to go to California, and that's where we ended up. In Santa Monica Beach in 1978. I was 19 years old, and I had the world in my hands at that time. I was unemployed, transferred my unemployment out there, and that was probably one of the fondest times of my life. That first year I spent out there. My friend didn't make it. He couldn't take the fast-paced life and turned around and went back to Michigan, but I stayed. I was living right on the beach by the Santa Monica Pier, and I thought I was in heaven that year, and those were some fond memories I have. But after that year was up, unemployment ran out, one thing or another. Oh, I met a woman, or I should say a girl, because we were both, I was 20 at the time, and she was from Canada, and she was going back to Montreal. And I had an opportunity to get a ride across the United States and up into Canada, and we traveled up there. And but that relationship was pretty much over after she left California. So it got me back. I ended up back in Michigan by way of Boston. And I stayed for a while, but California was calling. And I always wanted to repeat that first year I spent out there, so I went back to California. And I ended up getting a decent job at a place. And see, I was raised with good ethics, at least. I had good work ethics, good morals, went to a Lutheran school. And I hated that. I always seemed, well, the corporal punishment was in play back then, and I got a lot of it. But anyhow, I got a decent job, and I rose through ranks. I was promoted. I was 21 years old, and I was a manager of the TV service department for this company in Santa Monica, and doing well. But over time, my drinking got the best of me. Well, looking through the photos this morning, somebody I haven't shared in some of my talks is an old friend, Charlie, who I'd met the first year in California. And he was probably 15 years my senior and became like my best friend. And we moved from this beach hotel to a house. And he kind of took me under his wing and taught me all about alcohol, the ins and outs, and as well as other drugs, and became my best friend. And so I had some really good schooling out there, and alcohol slowly got the better of me. And after a few years, I had accumulated a couple drunk drive-ins, and my employer saw that I needed help, and they convinced me to go to a psychologist, and I did that, but didn't get any help there, and then they said, well, maybe you need to go to a psychiatrist, and I tried that too, but I didn't want any help, and I was introduced to AA in 1980. The day after my 21st birthday, I got my first driving offense. I backed into a car 3 times. I never made it out of the parking lot, but the judge saw fit to send me to AA. And I got to tell you, I despised Alcoholics Anonymous. I didn't want to have anything to do with sobriety, and I resented the fact that I was forced to go to meetings. And that stuck with me for a long time. And now, I'll share later, but I admitted early on that I had a problem with alcohol. In fact, I think I admitted that I was powerless over alcohol, but that's about as far as I went, and I was proud of it. I was okay to be an alcoholic. And anyhow, after several years of that job, they put up with me as much as they could, and the alcohol, slowly progressed and slowly consumed me to the point where they had to fire me. They had to let me go after 5 years. And after a couple months, I convinced them I'd changed my ways and I was going to do things different. And they hired me back because they knew that there was something inside me, that there was a good working individual, but it was all smoke. I lied to them, and it didn't last long, and they fired me. And I started to spiral down because I had a resentment for that company for years. And that was the first time I was living on the streets. But I had a van. I was living out of a van for a while, and I was comfortable with that. But that next year was kind of a mess for me because I didn't work and was using a lot of other things besides alcohol. And eventually got another job. Well, the girlfriend at the time I had, she convinced me that I needed to get out of the Santa Monica area or the LA area and move me up to the mountains in Big Bear, San Bernardino Mountains. She tried to get me away from my friends and cohorts, and it worked for a month or two, but she'd only come up for the weekend and be gone, and little did she know I'd sneak right back down the mountain, and that lasted for a few months, and I was right back in the Santa Monica area. And the next couple years are really foggy in my life. I spiraled down pretty low, and one thing stands out. I ended up living back at the beach apartments. I had a small room, and it all started with an alcohol binge. I'd been drinking for 2 days, and I was imbibing in other things, and I took a high quantity of a drug that I was going out, and I couldn't get out of that room, but something outside of me got me out of that room, and a neighbor got me down to the beachfront on the boardwalk where it was a Saturday afternoon, and I went out, and they called the paramedics, and I was pronounced dead on arrival because I had stopped breathing. I had no heartbeat, no pulse, and I was out for a little bit, and the lifeguard station was pretty close by, and they tried to revive me several times, and the friend of mine's girlfriend knew what I was doing those days, and finally, with a shot of adrenaline to the heart, it brought me back to life. And they took me to the hospital, and I remember vividly that coming back. I don't remember going out too much, but coming back, and I told myself I had to do something different, but I was so locked into the ways that as soon as I got out of the hospital, I was doing the same things again. And eventually some dear friends from back home convinced me that if I stayed in California, I'd be dead in no time. And they did convince me to come back to Michigan, and I did that. It was in the late 80s. But I continued to drink like there was no tomorrow. And I was back here a year or so, and life didn't really get any better. I just stopped using some of the other drugs, but alcohol was always there. I couldn't live without alcohol, and lo and behold, I met another woman, and she's traveling back to California, and so I followed her back to California. That's my third time back to California. That relationship was doomed from the start, and I stayed with a friend for a couple months until he kicked me out. I had a job for a little while, and then got fired from that. Looking back over my life, I think I've counted up. Had like 24 different jobs that I was fired from just about every one of them due to my alcoholism and that lifestyle. And I'd moved just about that many times too. But I had a van at the time, another van, and I started living in that van, and life was comfortable. I was sleeping down on the beach, I had get up in the morning, open the drapes, and there was the ocean. And that lasted for a year, but I'll tell you, my life spiraled down. I started stealing from stores and businesses, and eventually that caught up with me, and they towed my van. They impounded it, and the detectives wanted to have a talk with me, and I wasn't having nothing to do with that. So I started living on the streets, and I lived on the streets for about a year, and things got pretty miserable. And eventually it all caught up with me. My younger sister was living in Minnesota and tried to convince me to come to Minnesota. And my parents, friends, everybody wanted me to get help, but I didn't see it. I didn't think I needed it. And tell you what, I got locked up for one thing or another. And I tell you, looking back, I've lost track all the times I was arrested and locked up in county jails and city jails, and even once in Mexico. One of the pictures I saw this morning was me and two friends standing at the Mexican border. And that day we were drinking all the way down to Ensenada, went to Husong's Canteen, and I got so drunk, I followed some girls back to a cruise ship and tried to get on the ship, and ended up getting thrown in jail for drunk in public. And my buddies got drunk driving trying to find me, but paid their way off. And luckily we made it back across the border without too much trouble. But that wasn't the only time I went to Mexico and got in trouble, but there's not enough time. But this time I was locked up I can't tell you what it was for. And I was in the LA County Jail, and they called me out, and I was thinking I was getting an early release. And they took me to court, and it turns out they found my prints in this business that I had burglarized. And anyhow, I ended up getting sentenced to prison. To be honest with you, I think that saved my life. I remember the relief when I got that sentence, because if I would have stayed on the streets, I really wouldn't be here. And that seemed to happen to me over and over through my life, that I was rescued in one way or another. I used to get drunk at night, and I'd go down to the gang neighborhoods to try to score things, and I'd get jumped by gangs and left for dead. And somehow, miraculously, I'd end up in a hospital or whatnot, and I survived every time. But I think prison really saved my life at the time. And they gave me a 16-month sentence, and ended up serving just about a year on that 16 months. And now I was I used to tell everybody I was sober this whole year, right? And that's the only time that I would put down alcohol and have any sobriety was when I was locked up. But in reality, looking back, I wasn't sober. I just didn't drink for a year. Inside, I was just a dry drunk. I had worked no program at all. I was working on my physical attributes. I was running and working out, and I was probably in the best shape I'd ever been in when I left that prison. But mentally, I was a mess because all I did was just not drink for that year. The day they released me, I convinced myself, well, I could pick up one beer, and I did. It was on the train. They escorted me to the train station, and they put you on a train to get you out of town. And the first thing I did was beeline to the club car. I had my gate money in California. They give you $200 gate money cash when they release you. Plus, I had a little bit of money on my books. And the first thing I did was go to that club car, get a beer. And I couldn't stop after that. I couldn't put it down. When they dropped, when the bus was only a 51-mile trip down to Bakersfield, and then I got on a bus from the train, and I got a 6-pack to get on the bus. By the time I got to L.A., I had to get more. And, I was a mess. And within 2 days, I had to go report to my parole officer, and I was already violated. And I pleaded with her. I said, I can't go back to prison. I said, if I stay in California, I'm going to repeat this same life over and over. And I convinced her to send me back to Michigan. So she put in an interstate claim, and I was able to transfer my parole to Michigan in 1992. Now, all that did was get me away from the friends and the drugs, but the alcohol was still with me. And my parole officer turned out to be my father's best friend's son. So I had a pretty lenient PO. And within a year, or I want to say within 6 months, really, I got a drunk driving back in Michigan. All he said, you got to stay out of the bars, Kenny. You got to stay out of the bars. Yeah, God, I was drinking more and more. And alcohol was just slowly consuming me. And by 1995, I had got off parole, and I got caught again. And this was like my 6th driving offense. And I stood in front of the judge, and I expected him to sentence me to AA like he always did, right? But he didn't this time. And I asked why, and he said I was beyond help. And I got to tell you, I think that finally planted a seed. I didn't want to quit drinking, but it planted a seed. And the next several years, things got worse. I was no longer employable. I couldn't drive. I lost my license for good. It was revoked, and I still drove. And it's amazing that I got caught, but somehow slipped through the radar. And, the next 4 years were devastating. I went to work for an uncle in a die-cast factory, and I hated that job. And not only was the alcohol consuming me, but my emotions were consuming me. At the end of that time, I was no longer employable, and I started stealing again. And I was managing apartments for the 7 years. And the owner of those apartments finally fired me because he was a drinking buddy at one time, but he watched me just slowly dissolve and disintegrate as a person. And I got caught for stealing from a place and went in front of the judge, and I was going to get a few months, and I convinced him that I had a problem. Or that was the first time I'd ever admitted to any official in the courts that I had a problem, and I asked for help. And he allowed me to go to a treatment center up in Grand Rapids. That was the first time I'd ever gone to a treatment center. And I'll tell you, I remember vividly the day that my father drove me up there. Now, my parents had tried to get me help for 20, 30 years, and I refused, and they were so proud of me that day. I remember my father shaking my hand as he left, and I made it through 6 days of detox, and I was going to the nurse's station to get my last bit of medication for detox, and the nurse wasn't there, and they had the station locked up. And I used my resources, and I jimmied the door, and lo and behold, there was everybody's medication. And I couldn't resist. And I had my bathrobe on with big, deep pockets, and I just emptied bottles after bottles into my pockets. And it didn't take them too long to figure out who had broke in there, because I took a handful. And they took me down to the office, and they kicked me out, and I was devastated, and I pleaded for mercy, and they said I wasn't ready. They allowed me to call my parents, but they said I had to get off the property, so my parents were going to pick me up a couple miles from the location at a landmark, and on the way there I broke into a couple homes that came back to haunt me later. I mean, I was gone. I was beyond repair. I wasn't ready, obviously. But that day my parents picked me up. I didn't realize it was June 29th, 1999. It was my mother's birthday. And I just devastated her. I broke her heart. I ripped it out of her. Because they'd put up with me for all those years, and they had enabled me and helped me, but that was the last straw. And they took me back to Stevensville and didn't want to have anything more to do with me. And I was convinced I wasn't going to let it end there. So the next couple days I made some calls. I convinced another treatment center to let me in, because I knew what the alternative was, going to jail. I didn't want to go back to jail, so I convinced a treatment center in Dowagiac to let me in. I told them the whole truth, and I said I needed help, but it was the 4th of July weekend, and they said, well, they're not going to have enough staff, so they asked me to wait till the 6th, because the 4th was on a Sunday, so Monday was officially a holiday. So that Monday, I did my last fling, well, that weekend, but it kind of extended over to Monday, and I did some things I shouldn't have done. And so Monday night rolls around, and I come home, and I'm preparing to go to this treatment center. And God, I was so afraid of sobriety. All I knew was alcohol and other drugs all my life. How could I possibly live sober? I was terrified. And next thing I know, the squad cars come pulling up to the house. Stevensville only has two police cars, but there was like 6 squad cars come pulling up. They called backup from neighboring communities, and I had broke into some of the apartments over the weekend. I still had, although they had fired me from this job, I was still living there. I had to be out I was supposed to be out at the end of the month. Obviously, I wasn't. But I still had the master key. I managed to hold on to, and I was breaking into apartments, and I stole some guns, and they didn't take kindly to that. So I was arrested that night. It was July 5th, 1999, and they threw me in the cell, and because I had all these other charges, and now I had more charges pending, and because I had a history of burglaries, I was facing 10 years in prison, and I was lost. I laid in that cell that night, and I remember thinking about my life and my past, and it all came crashing down, and I finally asked God for help. All the years that I'd admitted I was powerless over alcohol, I would never admit that my life was unmanageable. And I finally admitted my life was unmanageable at that point. And God started working for me then. I didn't see it right away, but lo and behold, I only ended up with a year in the county. And I knew how AA worked, and I knew if I went to meetings for that year, I could get my license back. So I volunteered to go to meetings. And God put a volunteer in my life that encouraged me to work the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, I've been going to meetings on and off for 20 years. I didn't know there was 12 steps to Alcoholics Anonymous. Talk about a closed-minded individual. That's how bad I was. But he assured me that if I took these 12 steps and applied them in my life and worked them with him, that my life would change. And I'm willing to try anything. And I embraced those 12 steps like I'd never embraced anything in my life. And I got to tell you, before 6 months' time, I'd worked through most of those steps, and I came to know a new freedom and a new happiness they talk about in the big book. I had a spiritual awakening. Oh, life got good, and I was still locked up, you know. I ended up having one of the best trustee jobs in the jail. I actually, not only was I a car wash trustee, but I was the groundskeeper trustee, and I could go around the whole jail on the outside unescorted, which is relatively unheard of. I earned respect from the officers at that jail, and before the year was up, the judge allowed me an early release after 8 months into that very treatment center that I'd never made it to. And I was the first guy to ever show up at that treatment center, stone cold sober and having worked the 12 steps. And that started a new chapter in my life. And God, I remember the feeling being, I was just high on life. I didn't have a penny to my name. I had wasted everything many times over, and it was okay. It was okay because I had my sobriety. And my counselor at the treatment center convinced me that I needed to relocate and try something new. And there was a halfway house in Kalamazoo, the Serenity House. And I filled out an application, and I was accepted. And So I moved to Kalamazoo. No, I didn't plan on staying in Kalamazoo, but sobriety was good. I started going to different meetings, and then eventually I found my home group, the Comstock group. It's on the east end of Kalamazoo. I felt welcome there, like I didn't feel at any other meeting, and it hit home. And after some time, the guy that made the coffee was going on vacation for 2 weeks and asked for somebody to just take over for those 2 weeks. And I thought about it. I said, well, we only meet once a week, right? I said, well, no big thing, you know. I can make the coffee. So I took the key, and that guy never came back. But I'll tell you what, that introduced me to a whole new part of AA, and that's being of service. I had worked the steps and wasn't too familiar with our traditions at that point, but I became the coffee maker for the Comstock. And tell you what, I handed that key off about 2.5 years later. But that made me a part of AA, a part of the group, and it was an experience I'd never felt before. And eventually they saw I was doing such a good job. I mean, maybe the coffee wasn't that great, but I was committed. I was showing up every week, and I was making the coffee. I didn't even have a driver's license, but managed to get there every week and make the coffee. And then they elected me GSR of that group, General Service Rep, and told me I had to go to district meetings. And I made it to that first district meeting, and everything seemed so foreign to me, and I felt so uncomfortable. What the heck are they talking about? But I saw that some of those folks there had something I wanted. They had a quality of sobriety I didn't see in some other folks. And so I kept coming back and got active with that district. And eventually I was encouraged to go to some of those area assemblies. And I resisted that for years. You know, I would go to 1 or 2 a year, but I didn't know anybody, felt uncomfortable, out of my comfort zone. And then we had an assembly in Kalamazoo. And I attended, and I heard something at that assembly. They were talking about corrections committee. And I'd been going to that assembly on and off for a few years, but I didn't know they had no corrections committee. And they needed an alternate corrections chair. And I'd been in service long enough that I knew, well, the alternate doesn't have to do a whole lot, just be there for support. So I volunteered, and they made me the alternate corrections chair. Well, that chairperson never showed up again. So that got me active with Area 34, Western Michigan. And Mel was our secretary back then, and I had met her before that, but that's when we became friends because I was attending every assembly. And see, I thought maybe there was something I could do with that corrections committee, you know, maybe help, because I wasn't too good at sponsoring guys, and you know, but I had a lot of experience with corrections, you know. And I didn't think they'd ever let me go into a facility, but I was told, well, there's a lot you can do on the outside. There's correspondence, we can gather big books, we can do jail sales. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on the outside. And so I got active with the corrections committee, and I never turned back. And a year after I was involved with that corrections committee, I got accepted to go into the Kalamazoo County Jail. I was cleared. And then, lo and behold, I got a call later that day that I was also accepted to go into the Lakeland Correctional Facility in Colter. And that was amazing. Multiple-time felon. And they cleared me to go into these facilities. And I went into the Kalamazoo County Jail for a couple of years until they got a little stricter, and then they ran my clearance and said, wait a minute, we can't be letting him in here. And funny thing, it was right around that same time they tried to do that Lansing called the Lakeland Correctional Facility. They said, wait a second, we can't be letting him in here. And the special activities director at the time became my friend. I'd been going in for a couple of years, and him and the warden actually fought for me. It took them a year, but they fought Lansing, and they finally got me the full clearance. And I'm still going in there today. And I'll tell you, man, there was no feeling like that first time I stepped into that correctional facility. I still feel it just the last time I was in there, that when I leave and I look back at the fences and the barb and razor wire, and remember the times that I spent in those facilities, and now I've come full circle and I can help carry the message to the still suffering alcoholic. There's no feeling like that on this earth. Gratitude, man. Boy, do I got gratitude. Love and tolerance I'm working on. I'm still working on that. I got a lot more love and a lot more tolerance than I ever did, but I got gratitude today, and I got to remember that. But so I stayed active with the corrections committee, and then moved, and then I was elected as an alternate chair when Mel was our chair, and then lo and behold, they actually made me treasurer of the area. Somebody that used to steal from family members and loved ones and businesses, and so unrespectful, and they entrusted me with thousands of dollars, and that's a feeling I'll never forget, and I didn't let them down. I hope I was an honorable treasurer. And eventually, then I was elected alternate delegate under Mel, and eventually delegate. I just rotated out at the end of last year. Now that was an experience to represent all of Western Michigan at our General Service Conference in New York. I mean, from whence I came. At times I don't feel I deserve this. There's so many other people. I looked through those pictures this morning, and so many of my dear friends are gone. Page after page, these people are gone from alcoholism. And I'm still here. Why? Sometimes I just don't understand it. So when I can help, when I can try to carry that message, I try to always say yes. You know, sobriety hasn't always been perfect. I've had my ups and downs. You know, I was a year and a half sober, and when I got a call from my sister that my mother had cancer. And she was afraid to tell me. My mother didn't want to tell me because she was afraid that I couldn't handle it and I'd go back out. But I was able to be there. I was able to be there with my mother and spent a lot of time. From the time they diagnosed her, she made it just over 2 months. It was already stage 4 and terminal, but we became so close. You know, I was able to make amends to my mother, and she loved me. The last Christmas we spent together, she told me I was the love of her life because she watched me go through hell and then come back out on the other side. And they were so proud of me. But after my mother passed away, that was the closest I probably came to drinking, was the day she died. But I had a lot of support around me, and AA just came out of the woodwork. You know, they weren't going to let me pick up a drink. I had a lot of support. But my father gave up on life. They had been married 45 years, and he was devastated. And took him 5 years to wither away and die. But I was able to be there. I was a caregiver to my father. But thinking back to that day that I devastated on my mother's birthday and just broke her heart, I was able to repair that through Alcoholics Anonymous, through the program, the 12 steps and our 12 traditions. It's just been such an amazing journey. We were talking earlier about the International Convention. I've been able to attend a couple of them. My first one was in Toronto, and I was volunteered to speak on a corrections panel. I had only been active for a year in corrections, and so I was all focused on my talk and didn't really enjoy the conference. But I mean, it was an amazing experience to be in a room there was like, I think, 45,000 people at that event. And to be in one big meeting, that was a pretty neat experience. But then I went to San Antonio, and I knew what I was up against, so I went a couple days early. And see, one thing sobriety's allowed me is I started my own business 12 and a half years ago, and so my own employer, and I can take time off when I need to. And I went there a couple days early and volunteered to be a greeter, and that was probably one of the best things I've ever done in AA, because I met people from all over the world. And then to go into some of the panels and see how some of these other countries struggle. You know, we've had AA here in the United States for coming up on 80 years now. Some of those other countries have barely had it for a handful of years, and they're still struggling. They need our help, and that's the importance of world services. So, but I got to meet so many people from all over the world. Even when I was delegate, I got to meet people from all over the United States and Canada. It's just been such an amazing journey from where I came. The ashes. I remember clearly those last days when I was drinking. I don't ever want to forget. I was drinking a half gallon of vodka a day. I was strung out on heroin. And then I was locked up, and I went cold turkey. And they gave me just enough medication so that I didn't go nuts. And now look at me. I'm living the dream. I've got a second chance on life. you know, a new lease on life. It's just amazing, man. It's been such a rewarding experience to be a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. Today, when I say I'm an alcoholic, I'm proud to be an alcoholic because of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and recovery. So, thank you for letting me share tonight. That's all I got.